My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the third episode of the sixth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America. The last episode was an exciting conversation at the intersection of religion, new religious movements, and contemporary crisis. I want to thank Drs. Kelly Hayes, Knut Grau, Benjamin Zeller, and Daria Hartman for a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel or at our website, or if you want to listen to this or any episode, we are now available wherever you download your favorite podcasts. This year, our theme continues to be World on Fire, and today we continue with that theme with another powerhouse panel of theorists that will explore religion and giving in the midst of our rapidly changing world. Today, we're looking at religion and the shifting demand for philanthropy. We and this panel will explore the emerging patterns of everyday giving and volunteering, as well as major trends in big philanthropy, and they will ask how they impact and reflect shifts in religious life, civic society, and public discourse. I'm so excited about this conversation, and I'm glad that you all have joined us today. Today's host is my colleague and friend, Dr. David King. David King is the Karen Lake Buttrey Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies within the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. In 2022, he served as the Fulbright Scotland Distinguished Scholar at the University of Edinburgh, and his first book was God's Internationalists, World Vision, and the Age of Evangelical Humanitarianism. Thank you so much, David, and everyone, please join us for this exciting and very important conversation. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Joseph, and I'm delighted to be here to host this kind of conversation, and really looking forward to your questions and comments as well as we get going with our panel. This is an interesting topic to bridge religion and philanthropy together. And over the decade plus that I've had a chance to work at Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, we've been putting these conversations together at this intersection of the ways that faith inspires and informs giving. In recent years, I think what we've begun to see are some shifts and changes that are important for us to kind of consider together. One of those, and working together with a number of leaders in the nonprofit and philanthropic space through the Generosity Commission over the last few years, we came up with some key themes and sort of foundational principles for where we might see these conversations going. And one of those that held true for me is that generosity matters for the fabric of American society and for those who care about civility, compassion, equality, and democracy. And indeed, we would not want to live in a world without generosity. And second, faith matters in manifold ways for generosity. So we know through numbers of years of scholarship that religion is one of the strongest predictors of giving and volunteering. Religious Americans are more likely to give and volunteer, of course, to religious causes, but secular causes as well. But third, we know that patterns of faith and giving are changing in significant ways. We know from a number of recent surveys and polls that religious affiliation and participation in religious institutions is decreasing, even though forms of spirituality or those who are spiritual but not religious are increasing or evolving. And at the same time, the percentage of Americans who are giving and volunteering overall is shrinking. But we also know that new forms of generosity, maybe hidden traditions of generosity, are coming into better view for how people engage and share with one another. And finally, I think we can say that religion, faith, spirituality, more broadly remain a vital asset and force in this world for good and for ill in our communities. And oftentimes religion may often be overlooked or maybe taken for granted in our focused attention in the world of philanthropy. Often, at the same time, religion doesn't fully understand philanthropy as well. So again, this bridge or this need for working across what might be blind spots or barriers. So when we're looking at these sort of barriers or blind spots, for some of us, there's a lack of general understanding of the role religion plays in our society. Others of us might think, in contrast, that we assume that religious factors remain relatively static. There's not much new to observe. In some cases, religious topics might be perceived as more private matters, more uncomfortable or inappropriate for us to discuss in public. And then still others of us may relegate anything that might look like faith-based organizations, schools, or nonprofits as a special, sort of unique faith sector, kind of segmented or distinct from the other broader charitable landscape. So our colleagues today defy these tendencies towards these and other blind spots and are leading efforts in a variety of ways to build bridges between religion and philanthropy. So our task today is to open up space to put these in conversation, to hear from colleagues who are steeped in both the scholarly but also the real life, deeply informed practitioner space and ongoing questions about how to do this work well and shaping the field at this intersection. So I want to briefly introduce our panelists and then throw some opening questions their way so we can begin this conversation of bridging this connection between religion and philanthropy. Ben Soskus, first is a historian of philanthropy and civil society with a PhD in American history from Columbia University, and currently serves as a senior research associate at the Urban Institute's Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. He co-edits the web publication Histphil, History of Philanthropy, and currently this year serves as a visiting scholar at the independent sector. I admire Ben not only for his historical research, but he is a constant contributor to the Chronicle, Philanthropy, Washington Post, Atlantic, The Guardian, a number of current publications. In some sense, that as a rare scholar is focused, particularly as a rare historian who's focused on putting these questions directly in the conversation with what's happening right now in our conversations today. Catherine Orsborn is a Senior Director of Programs and Public Policy at the El Hibri Foundation, leading initiatives that strengthen leadership, resilience, and cross-sector collaboration to advance a just and pluralistic society. Before coming to El Hibri, she was the Executive Director of Shoulder to Shoulder, working with faith leaders, leading advocacy efforts, particularly addressing anti-Muslim bias. With a PhD in religion, she's published and taught in a number of contexts focused particularly on religion, peace building, global humanitarianism, and models that bridge between, again, both scholarship and practice. And our final panelist is Jason Garrett, who's been working for decades, multiple decades, to bridge, organize, and fund member-based communities, faith groups, and more to bring about justice. Currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Faith, Bridging, and Belonging at the Freedom Together Foundation, whose mission is to build the power of people who've been denied it by expanding the number and diversity of people who are rooted in a shared vision and community, and who activate their collective power to challenge oppressive systems and build a more democratic society. Jason has served with the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundations in previous roles. He's been a community organizer with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, a Fulbright Scholar, a Harvard Div grad who continues to serve as a minister in his faith tradition as well. So thank you all panelists for agreeing to take part in this conversation. And from the many venues and perspectives that you bring to it, I'm excited to help us have this conversation together. So maybe an opening question for us. Ben, let me start with you. You come at this issue from sort of being a keen observer in the philanthropic landscape, trained as a historian, so focused on working with these contemporary questions. So probably from the view of a critical scholar of philanthropy, what are the top questions or crises that you see that are being faced right now? And how might they be similar or different than the past? And is there a connection to religion's role here?
Well, great question, David, and great to be here and great to be in conversation with you all. Let me just outline four big questions that I think philanthropy is facing now. All these are questions that have some historical lineage to earlier ones, but I think in the current moment have a very particular feel to them. One is this question of philanthropy as a component of civil society. And this is that might seem a kind of truism to people out there, but for quite a while, there was a tendency of philanthropy, and I mean by philanthropy, large-scale philanthropy, foundation philanthropy, to see that sector is sort of distinct from the traditional way of understanding civil society, the organizations that they funded. But for a number of reasons, there's a real sense now of kind of solidarity within the philanthropic community, of a sense of shared identity with the groups they fund. And I think that's extremely important, something we can get into. Another challenge is the challenge of philanthropy, and here I would speak not just about large scale giving, but giving more generally, and a crisis of social disconnection. You mentioned, David, that this trend that we've seen really for almost 20 years. It's often called the dollars up, donors down trend. This idea that giving is now even more and more concentrated in the figures of large-scale donors, so wealthy individuals who give lots of money. So the dollars of total aggregate giving have been increasing steadily now for, again, at least 2 decades. But the number of donors, the people who actually give and give at least to nonprofits, has been declining. And so there's this general question of what is the relationship between giving and a sense of civic participation, civic engagement? Are there ways in which the kind of structural dimensions of philanthropy are actually eroding people's sense of agency and encouraging a sense of disconnection? Or is there a way in which we should be kind of reimagining what it means to give? Are people giving in different ways, in new ways, in ways that potentially could encourage a sense of connection? The third question, this is just a very particular question of the moment, is one about philanthropy as a political actor. It's for obvious reasons a controversial question, and that contains a question of how political should philanthropy be. That's both a legal question and a normative one. But also there's this really fascinating kind of quandary that a lot of donors are struggling with now, which is in a time of real need, and in a time when the role of government is being fought over and is in real contention. Does giving potentially license retrenchment in some way, or can you give in a way that doesn't actually cement the particular configurations of political economy? Can you give in a way that both assumes that some things are the domain of private responsibility, but without diminishing the role of government? And the fourth, and I'll stop after this, is this is a little more diffuse and harder to really kind of figure out exactly where it started, but I think there's a real crisis of confidence in philanthropy, and here I think there's definite connections to the world of both religious institutions, but also of just spiritual meaning and identity across the board. In major issues confronting the nation and the world, we've seen a kind of pullback of major donors, a sense of diminished expectations, diminished ambition, and I think that's in a way a real crisis that has long-lasting implications. I'll stop there. There's no limit to how many other crises are facing the philanthropy now. So if we have time, I'm happy to rattle off a few more.
Thanks, Ben. I think you really hit on the key topic of the panel, which is sort of that crisis in philanthropy. So noting not only the historical trajectory, but some of those key questions that are right front and center to us today. Catherine, I'm thinking about your work at El Hibri and the unique work that El Hibri has done to maybe in some sense pull many philanthropic actors together on these questions. But with some of that sort of the groundwork that Ben has sort of described for us, how have you seen your philanthropy's work with religious questions or religious institutions in particular? Is there a particular approach that El Hibri has taken, or that you've seen as trends in the work of philanthropy and religion together?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for laying out those crises in question so neatly, Ben. That was really helpful. So we talk about EHF as a community-built, intergenerationally focused institution, and we invest in three primary buckets. So we focus on leadership, strategy, and action. And the way we talk about this is that we're drawing on faith values to build stronger, more resilient communities that advance pluralism and shared flourishing by investing in cross-sector leadership, mobilizing philanthropy, and convening around some of the biggest challenges. So at EHF, we work primarily with American Muslim civil society, as well as with allies that are helping to advance inclusion of and within Muslim communities. And I'll note that that's how I entered the work, starting in academia, earning a PhD in religion with an emphasis on religion and social change. And while my own dissertation research focused on this nexus of religion and social cohesion in more international contexts, I felt this pull back to my own context to do this work domestically. So I've been with EHF about 5 years, and I've seen so much value in the approach that EHF takes. This kind of faith part of EHF's identity goes beyond who EHF identifies as our target beneficiaries, which I mentioned primarily is American Muslim civil society, but it's also like a core part of the foundation's identity itself and how we approach the work. So it's about both who we serve, but also who we are as a foundation that's rooted in what we talk about as universal Islamic values, meaning values within Islam that speak to and resonate within broader society. So we see faith in that sense as an important bridge between communities, a source of like shared moral imagination that helps us invest in people and ideas that build belonging. And I think it's helpful to think about our approach to religion in 3 different ways: civic, ethical, and narrative. So this idea that when communities lead from their deepest values, they can create a public life that's both pluralistic as well as grounded in moral principles that are true to the various people and communities coming into the space. One of our anchor programs on the narrative front is our public narrative training, which we've been doing for a decade now and have worked with Harvard professor Marshall Gans to train nearly 900 Muslim and ally leaders in this practice of connecting their own stories to the change that they're working to produce in the world in a way that's simultaneously authentic as well as strategic in the way that they're thinking about connecting them to the change that they're wanting to see. We've seen a lot of impact here of, it's been used in everything from political speeches of the first Sikh mayor in America to viral TED Talks sharing stories of the experience of what it is to be Muslim in America. But I also think about the importance of the cohorts that we bring together through this. So it's about training people to tell their own individual stories and call people into the journey that they're on. But it's also about creating cohorts that like bear as much fruit as the training itself by sort of connecting grantees and partners within our space to make connections and to be able to create work together that really exceeds what they can do individually, in part because they're connecting with each other in this space that's asking them to be really vulnerable and allows for this like deep trust building. And we're really we do a lot of curation of these classes to make sure they're a balance of cross-sector leaders, Muslim, ally, and people that we think could build something together. And we've seen that happening quite a bit. And then so much of our focus at EHF is on moving the work with American Muslims from a place of what we talk about as firefighting to flourishing. So what does this proactive work look like to build a community that thrives within the broader American context rather than just being stuck in reaction mode, dealing with crisis after crisis? If you talk to anybody who's been working in the American Muslim like civil society space for the last couple of decades, they'll tell you, and this isn't unique to the Muslim community, but they'll tell you that it's crisis after crisis after crisis, and there hasn't been this space to sort of do bigger picture, forward-looking work around like, what does it actually look like for this community to thrive, to flourish in this country? And so, of course, we need the orgs that are putting out the fires, and we fund and support that part of the ecosystem as well. But we've really stepped into this space of more future-oriented thinking and planning because we saw such a vacuum within the community ecosystem, to help the communities that we're serving to like look beyond this moment to the future. And so we see this as kind of part of this longer moral arc. We're spending a lot of time right now leading conversations on what kind of ancestors we are becoming, and that sort of intergenerational lens keeps us, I think, from treating leadership development and for pluralism work as like short-term projects. We're focused on, what is the civic and spiritual infrastructure that can sustain future generations actually look like? So I'll stop there, but looking forward to digging more into this conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. I love that image of, how we can move from both firefighting, continue to do that crisis work, but also move towards that flourishing and that moral arc that you mentioned. And really descriptive thinking about how El Hibri is imagining not only, their identity as who they serve, but who we are and what that means for the work that they do. Jason, I'm thinking about the work that you do in your foundation, which, is maybe you can maybe describe it more as a secular foundation in some sense, but also but with a keen interest in the work that you do at this intersection and with religious and faith-driven communities. From a relatively new space in revisioning the work of Freedom Together, how have you seen Philanthropy's work, or maybe within your own foundation or networks and allies with faith communities, and what might this current moment or opportunity look like now for what you're doing and helping to connect with?
Yeah, thank you, David. This moment, well, just in terms of how I've seen the work of religion and faith communities, I've been in philanthropy maybe over 13 plus years, and it's evolved. I've seen a spectrum. I've seen people be hungry for knowing more and engaging, and I've seen people have an allergy to faith, given some of the harm that they have been a part of. I've seen people have a curiosity knowing that they may not come from that tradition, but also they have a suspicion because of things that they see in the public arena. I've seen also a spectrum on the role of philanthropy and related to religion and faith. And so there are certain ones that do this work that will comfort the afflicted. They give a lot of services and a lot of ways of meeting people in their needs. But in my preaching, one of my mentors in preaching often say our role is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted. In this role of challenging why things are the way they are, the ability to be able to reshape and reimagine what we have and what we're in, that is also the role, not just, I would argue, of a preacher, but it's also the role of a foundation. And that is a role that I've seen some people be less comfortable with. And when I think about this moment and this opportunity, I've raised the question of, well, why are we here in this moment? It's not because of any one person. It's not because of any one thing. It's a number of things, as we all know, but it's partly because it's not just about meeting people's material needs, it's about meeting their spiritual needs. And people are longing for something. They have felt like they are pawns in someone else's game. They have felt like despite voting, the systems and studies show this, that even when they do engage, it does not, the systems are not accountable, and what they have put forth is not what the results and the outcomes, what they lead to. And so it is a feeling of when Ben talked about this crisis of confidence and the disconnection. Well, part of it is a feeling of a lack of agency, that what we do and people care about what matters. And part of it is this lack of connection and the feeling of belonging. And so we are in this place because partly we have not been able to cultivate both the connections and the agencies that would allow people to feel like they can shape what's happening. And when you don't feel like that, then you resort to a range of different things that are not healthy for a person or for an environment. And so when I think about what this moment requires and what opportunity there is, well, I think my foundation is a testament. Over a year and a half ago, I stepped in and was brought on to lead this area of faith, bridging, and belonging. And so that we don't want to just sprinkle this on top of other stuff. We believe that there is a spiritual crisis in our country. And while we're a secular foundation, people are made up of spirit. And there's a crisis here. And so we're going to carve out a large foundation. We're going to carve out a whole area, one of the few areas in the foundation, an entire area dedicated to thinking about how to meet both the agency and the crisis of agency and the crisis of connection, and build that in a way that is integrated, and having faith and spirituality be a key part of that.
Let me follow up on that, Jason, and sort of think about the questions of belonging, but also how have you begun to think about bringing to the table not only the economic or political or material measures, but how you think about sort of that holistic notion of oftentimes bringing the spiritual categories to bear and with communities, but also the need to bring that to the table in order to think about these bigger questions that you all are engaged in.
Yeah, thank you. We're doing that in a few different ways. I'm in the process of what is very unusual. I've only seen it in a couple of cases of hiring internally someone who's like a chaplain and a consultant role that is there for our colleagues, knowing that, again, we are not just here to do work, but we feel, we hurt, we are trying to make sense of it ourselves, not just in the strategy realm, but also in the meaning and purpose. We are engaging significant faith efforts where faith leaders, part of this is we know people have this hunger throughout the country. And so how do you equip faith leaders in the Muslim tradition, in the evangelical tradition, in the Catholic tradition, in the Jewish tradition, in the Black church tradition, and so on and so forth? How do you equip them to tap into that hunger around the country that is beyond their current capacity? They are being challenged to build out in places across the country because they know people are hurting, and they know they want something, and it's not just a law. They want something that is beyond themselves. They want a connection to something greater. And that means part of agency, that means part of connection, that means a connection to God or something greater than themselves, a purpose, a vision, as Catherine talked about, this element of flourishing in a future-oriented vision. Who better to do that than people of faith? So those are two ways. I could talk about more, but those are two ways we're tapping into that element of spirituality.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, that helps us think about the oftentimes that clear division between what's religious or spiritual and what philanthropy feels like they can jump in on. That's more measurable or secular, to use these kind of categories. I mean, another question oftentimes is this question of religious diversity or pluralism. And Catherine, I know that a lot of the work that O'Hibree's has done, that you've done in your career, has been across these divides and bridge building. As our religious landscape continues to change, philanthropy, I would say there has been a trend in the last decade that philanthropy and several of the philanthropic actors that here on this panel and more broadly have tried to engage questions of religious pluralism as one of the antidotes and key aspects of building more flourishing democracies or communities. How would you, describe that work from your perspective, knowing that, something like religious pluralism is not an easy thing to kind of to describe or define?
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean, I have been able to, dug into it on the academic perspective, but have had the opportunity to work in it from two sort of major perches. And when I was at Shoulder to Shoulder, we were really looking at pluralism as this opportunity for building sort of shared buy-in from the organization was started by Christian and Jewish organizations to push back against anti-Muslim discrimination. And that was part and parcel of their existing relationships with American Muslim communities, but really kind of co-owning this idea that any religious community not experiencing access to freedom and dignity is something that all of us have to co-own and have to work together on. And so that was one sort of piece of the work that I kind of come with that lens. But at EHF, we really see pluralism as this sort of long-term commitment to this idea that belonging has to be built both within and across communities. And so we've long had a focus on interfaith partnerships and ensuring that Muslim communities find, access as well as voice within more mainstream platforms. But we also recognize that pluralism really has to start within your own community in many ways. And so we've prioritized quite a bit of intra-community work within Muslim communities, helping sort of diverse Muslim constituencies build trust and collective capacity rather than getting stuck in some of the ongoing internal division and debates. And that's something we've, held a number of convenings around at the foundation. And I also think organized philanthropy in particular can play a critical role in connecting the dots between some of the various efforts to promote pluralism. So being able to identify what's out there that's working, that could scale, and either investing or doing some, philanthropic advocacy to help support that, while also connecting various players in the field to one another to help them advance their work from more of a collective impact lens, which I have seen as a really important role that philanthropy can sort of play in kind of connecting those dots. We also see like faith-rooted or faith-informed philanthropy, not just as a niche practice, but as a lens that can really enrich the whole sector. And I resonate a lot with what Jason was saying with this. Our own partnerships include both faith-based and secular funders that share a commitment to belonging and to civic health and to lots of these sort of shared values. And in that way, we're helping philanthropy recognize that these questions of faith aren't just like marginal or like siloed questions, but really are foundational to what helps us understand like what motivates humans towards positive social change, as well as the tangible communities to be able to advance that change.
That's really helpful. And thinking about the bridge building not only between religious communities, but within the philanthropic sector itself. Ben, I'm thinking about there's, to take that pluralism question and turn it to philanthropy more specifically. I know there, maybe some big discussions that you spend a lot of time thinking about around philanthropic pluralism and philanthropic freedom. Maybe you can just sort of, in a nutshell, describe some of those kind of conversations. And then let me give you a second part of the question that you kind of, began to describe in your opening comments about, the capacity around civil society, but with the fragility of civil society, thinking about this question of pluralism, but we can't ignore this sort of particular space we're in around polarization in particular. So as we turn that back to philanthropy and religion, or meaning generally, sort of, give us a sense of these debates within philanthropy around pluralism, but also what might that mean for this particular moment we're in around this, particular high point of polarization in our country.
Sure. Just before I do that, I want to underscore something that Catherine and Jason said, because I think it's really profound and important, and it has a certain resonance for me historically. This idea that there is a tendency, or there has been a tendency, to see religion as a kind of separate, sequestered realm of program that's not really integrated into the whole self, and it's not integrated into the whole foundation or institution, and therefore it's not integrated into the whole society. And I mean, there are deep historical roots to this, which really go back to the founding of modern philanthropy, where it positions itself quite explicitly against a charitable ethic, a kind of explicitly religious charitable ethic, and instead defined itself as scientific, as rational. In fact, Andrew Carnegie's foundation, when they're giving to universities, insists on them revoking their sectarian basis in order to accept funds. So there's this fundamental ways in which secularism, as a ethic in and of itself, was part of what it meant to be philanthropic. But I think that has serious drawbacks and limitations. And it's, I think, a really important dimension of the current moment, and the work that both Catherine and Jason is doing is really pushing against that, and pushing against the sense that there are religious funders who support religion as a discrete sphere of human activity, as opposed to religion being just sort of sewn throughout the kind of garment of philanthropy and human life more generally. So I think that's terrific, and a theme and a trend that I think could have really important repercussions down the line. In terms of pluralism, yeah, I mean, pluralism is one of these buzzwords that you drop it into a conversation and you're going to get a lot of reactions. But it's interesting, even within the last couple of years, it's had a pretty significant shift in the way that in the politics of pluralism, you might say, in the philanthropic sector. In April of 2023, there was a op-ed in the kind of flagship publication of the Philanthropic Center, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, in which 6 leaders of ideologically diverse foundations wrote an editorial basically defending pluralism, championing pluralism as one of the things that philanthropy had a responsibility to safeguard. That was one of the main goals, and they listed a bunch of ways they would do this, in part through a kind of civil discourse, and in part through a kind of rejection of any potential for either private or public bodies to prescribe certain forms of giving. And the op-ed got a lot of pushback, in part because it was seen as a way to platform views that were really hurtful to a whole bunch of folks. One leading sort of consultant in the sector wrote a counter op-ed in which he kind of compared the imperative of a kind of pluralistic approach to define all giving as good as the equivalent of saying that all lives matter. That there's a politics behind that statement, even that you really have to be cognizant of. And so pluralism became one of these. There was a real kind of tension about what did it actually mean to defend pluralism in a public way? What did it mean to actually want to engage across difference? How was it licensing certain types of actions? Was it blind to certain inequalities and injustices? And the really important debate. But one really interesting thing that's happened in the last couple of months, really, last year, is a kind of return of a consensus school of pluralism within the sector, in that when the sector has perceived itself to be under attack by the state, and in many sense, I think a lot of folks feel that way now, pluralism became a kind of principle that folks across the spectrum could again rally around. And so we've seen from right and left pluralism be invoked as the common bond that unites people, no matter what their ideological positioning is. And so from a term that was, I think, there was a real there was some real peril surrounding discourse around pluralism. I think now it's sort of reemerged as a really fundamental kind of tenet of civil society. The other quick thing I'll say about pluralism is there's another way to think about pluralism, a smaller way. So there's philanthropy's relationship to pluralism in terms of the role it has in terms of safeguarding pluralism for society more generally, for the polity more generally. I think there's a really interesting dimension, which is within philanthropy, about the conflict between a pluralistic approach, which has really been the defining approach for philanthropy for a century, which is that we just basically allow, we want to encourage people to give with their hearts, give however you want. And somehow the amalgamation of all these different idiosyncrasies and approaches to giving, that will amount to something that is in the public good. In the last decade, there's been the kind of ascension of another approach, another way of thinking about giving, which is very prescriptive, which is a more toleration of saying there are certain ways of giving which are better than others. We've seen this with the effective altruist movement. We've seen this with racial equity grant making. And that's a really powerful counter to this kind of much older tradition of pluralism. I think that's something that we're at a sort of stalemate between those two approaches. But I think it's a really fascinating kind of unfinished conversation that a lot of folks are having in the sector.
Thanks, Ben. That's a good synopsis and a good segue. Well, first, I want to mention to the folks who are here listening to us, we really would appreciate your questions. So if you can go into the Q&A and type those questions in, we'd love to bring your voice and questions into the room, into the panel. And so while you're thinking of those questions, go ahead and please kind of open that up and submit those questions to us, and we'll want to direct those to the panel. But I'm thinking particularly, Jason, leading your way, I'm thinking to Ben's last point, whether it's whether it's pluralism, thinking about, kind of giving where your heart might lead, or the more strategic kind of giving, where we want to make, measurable impact and outcomes. I think from both perspectives, we can say, if you're not engaging with faith communities to whatever end that philanthropy or communities are looking for, you're not bringing the best assets, the full set of assets to the table. When you're making sort of an apologetic, or you're making a clear case for why faith communities have a role to play in whatever that larger question might be. How do you have that conversation with, fellow, colleagues in philanthropy, or in the space that you've been in as a community organizer, nonprofit leader, community voice?
Well, I recall I was at a particular foundation, and I made the argument that no matter what you think about faith, one way or another, when the majority of the people who you are grant making to, the people that they serve, are people of faith, they have certain belief sets, it would be just a strategic error. Never mind about what you think about faith or religion. It would just be a strategic error to think that you can achieve progress towards some aim and discount a whole segment of your analysis in a corporation of a population with their values and their beliefs. So that just purely on a strategy level, regardless of what you think. I think you mentioned strategy, and strategy is this notion of being able to design a plan or action to achieve some particular aim. And I think that is where attention lies. When I think about religious pluralism, I've seen on one hand, foundations and secular organizations have failed to see the adoption of how religious pluralism could significantly advance their strategic interests. And on the other hand, I've seen how some faith communities and philanthropic institutions have been hesitant to pair pluralism with power, which just purely means like the ability to achieve a purpose. And that, I believe, is a critical gap. It's where pluralism and power fail to meet, because they are, while I certainly respect pluralistic approaches to funding, et cetera, in doing good, the lack of pluralism without power, it doesn't accurately account, in my opinion, for some of the things that are at play. And so you're trying to achieve a purpose without, just the same way I critique certain funders about trying to achieve a purpose without thinking about faith institutions in religious folks and their values. Trying to achieve a purpose without thinking about power dynamics, why things are the way they are, is also a misstep. And so that's part of the, I think, critique I would offer to both sides, to be able to think about not properly account for constituency or faith, or not properly account for dynamics that lead us to be where we are now. It's going to be hard to get to a different place.
Yeah, I love that. I love that back and forth between pluralism, questions of pluralism and power. And I'm thinking, Catherine, of your work in particularly in the bridge building and narrative, the narrative framing that El Hibri has led to, and you've done over your career. I mean, what does an attention to religion do when you're addressing those questions about democracy and belonging? Not not forgetting those questions of power and strategy, but is there a role for shaping that kind of the language, the narrative of bridge building that is essential to also kind of setting the table for that work around democracy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll go back to I think about this in two primary ways. One is the civic infrastructure that faith communities provide. So thinking about, I have been thinking a lot lately about Alexander de Tocqueville's writing about the improbability of democracy in America, but how civic institutions essentially would be the thing that saved it. And that's like, a terrible oversimplification of his argument, but that idea that it's this, like Ben was talking earlier about this crisis of social disconnection. And I think that faith communities are one of the sort of hubs of being able to address that. And with democracy under so much duress in our current moment, even with the decline in religion, I think it's still one of the most effective forms of community connectedness when you look at like local community realities. So there's that social infrastructure piece when it comes to religious communities, but also this moral imagination piece that I'll go back to as well. And more specifically, I think that faith communities have these moral resources to imagine things differently than we're seeing right now that we can be tapping into. And I know that's, Jason has talked about this as well, this idea of calling people into a future that includes everyone. And I think there's the hope factor here as well that's really baked into the DNA of so many faith traditions, countering this kind of like apathy and even nihilism that we see right now in society of so much happening and people feeling like they can't do anything about it. I think it is often the moral imagination of faith communities that can kind of call us back to a place of hope and imagination of something different. So I think that's one of the most powerful things that faith can kind of bring to the table, as well as the power of narrative. Like you mentioned, the work we do around storytelling, the stories that we amplify are what shape what people believe is possible. And I think, through various initiatives to sort of uplift narrative and create new narratives, we can invest not only in like individual storytellers, but in a culture of sharing that really shifts how people see one another, but also how we see our shared future. So I think those are, the civic infrastructure piece and then the moral imagination, I think, are the two anchors for me on that.
Oh, I love both of those. I'm thinking, and sometimes, we've been having some conversations around this moral imagination in particular. Sometimes these religious or moral languages that faith communities maybe have at the ready, perhaps don't always translate to, formal philanthropy or philanthropic institutions. Are there roadblocks there? Are there signs of hope for how we can sort of help shape these larger questions that are not defined by faith communities, but I think are open space, as Catherine was talking about, for a broader moral imagination for rebuilding or building a civil society or bridges around in our country?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I know that you and I are thinking a lot about. I mean, so I want to both recognize the challenge, but also suggest that there is some hope. There are a number of foundations out there, and leading philanthropists and the folks we have on this panel are great representatives of them that incorporate the idioms and the logics and the moral imagination that religion and spiritual life provide into the work of philanthropy, and they do it every day. And that incorporation is just a natural part of their work. But I think it's fair to say that there is also there's a considerable divide between how a lot of folks in the philanthropic sector think about moral responsibility, about the philanthropic responsibility, and religious talks, let's say. And there are a host of reasons for that. I mean, there's some historical reasons that I laid out. That there's in the DNA of philanthropy itself, there is a kind of secular germ that's focused on efficiency and effectiveness and sort of root causes that I think and a antipathy towards the charitable defined in religious terms that still lingers on. And I think in recent times the focus on what's measurable and quantification and strategy has at times pushed out the engaging with more religious modes of thinking about what is good and how we do it. But I think what was very clear, both within the official philanthropic sector, but it reflected more generally, is that there's a real hunger for moral frameworks and for a language to talk not just about programs and effectiveness, but why it all matters, what the underlying values are. I would even say there's a sort of vacuum now. Some of that vacuum is based on large kind of cultural forces. Some of it's also because the language of equity, which provided a lot of that structure, that moral imagination, is now much more perilous as a public language, at least for philanthropy. And so there's a kind of an imposed vacuum in a sense. And I've noticed myself, and I've talked to folks and heard people relaying this, that I think there is more appetite now for people within the professional world of philanthropy who traditionally have not thought of themselves as faith funders, so to speak, to turn and to look not necessarily at doctrinal and creedal, religious views, but something like meaning and values and underlying kind of the underlying logic of what it means to be good, and that's something I think philanthropy has often skipped over and went right to the kind of effectiveness and efficiency discourse, and I think it's really healthy that if there is a vacuum that we start to try to fill it.
I love that, whether it's a metaphor of a vacuum or sort of a pendulum back and forth, where we move to moral to strategy and to measurement. We've got a couple questions in the chat, and Catherine, one I'll throw your way. It's a really good question Aaron asked, which is, if we're thinking about this move towards moral imagination, leaning into that for philanthropies and nonprofits, what are some ways that we can lead philanthropic and nonprofit leaders in that direction without polarizing those outside of their tradition? I think oftentimes we've definitely seen this as the case when we're trying to work across religious traditions, where we might find things in common, but religious traditions might disagree on quite a lot, as far as sort of key foundational principles. Are there ways that you've seen some of that, kind of how do you bridge those kinds of gaps when you're trying to look towards a third thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the conversations we've been having around this at El-Hibri have often included voices outside the tradition in the conversations. And so, I mean, I myself am not Muslim, and I'm sitting at the tables around with these conversations and thinking together about how do we honor the tradition and not paint everything with this broad brush where there's no more particularity. I think that's really important, to be able to talk about those particularities, but in a way that's not exclusive, or a way that's not pushing against, but can we talk about and honor the reality that there are particularities, and of course within a tradition there are also differences of how people think about or approach certain pieces of that tradition, but if we can create spaces for these conversations among people who are from different backgrounds to talk about these pieces in a way that it allows for some of that particularity without it, pushing against or pushing out people who aren't part of that tradition. And I think the work of that is partly on, communities having those conversations to think about, how does this land, how does this connect to people outside, as well as, the curiosity from people who aren't of that tradition in that conversation, being able to ask those questions around, like, that doesn't resonate with me, tell me more, those sorts of things. But I've seen it sounds in theory like very difficult, but I've actually seen it working really well in a lot of different contexts where people are able to sort of bring their unique perspective and particularities. And maybe that's, that is part of this pluralism conversation more broadly, the ability to hold these unique perspectives that may in some ways clash with others, but can we allow for space for people to hold those without it, excluding other people by holding a perspective that's different?
I mean, it seems like that's so hard to do in our current climate, but I think it's a really a measured practice, I think, in both our philanthropic religious, among philanthropic religious actors, and to make that space in civil society. I think that's such a key practice, and I'm glad you all are leading the way there. Another question, Rachel asked, to kind of Ben painted that history, and Jason alluded to it with his own, professional background, which is, this move towards maybe the secularizing or professionalizing of philanthropy over the, particularly over the 20th and 21st century, but making space really to kind of for philanthropy, maybe to have an open possibility for working and maybe even empowering faith communities. Kind of Rachel was saying maybe a little bit more on what accounts for that, but Jason, I'll leave this question to you. What gives you hope for easing this kind of disconnect, maybe in this moment, in just another, with a minute or two?
Yes. What gives me hope is that it's something happening when you see certain people of faith inside of these places that are shaping and helping make decisions. Back in 13 years ago, when I started in philanthropy, I didn't see as many people of color in leadership in ways that I do right now. So that progression, I think, is one thing that gives me hope. I think the crisis that we're in and that we've come through from decades of people not having connection, agency, this crisis has called people to long for something different. And they've kind of exhausted a lot of the other mechanisms, the electoral mechanisms, the other things. So people are grasping for something else. And if this could be within their reach, I think that gives me hope. It gives me hope around people's connection to seeing themselves as a part and connected to one another, and beginning to see a part of this shared future, and how that I'm actually not that there. I'm suffering like this person over here and they're Muslim, but man, we're both getting it. And that ability to break down those walls and for people to see that, those are some of the things that give me hope.
Thanks, Jason. I'm gonna do this kind of in like a last sort of kind of interview style, maybe just 10-15 seconds. Ben, Catherine, are there what question are you left with, or what gives you hope in this conversation about religion and philanthropy? Ben, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think I have a sense of crisis that there is often real possibilities and opportunities. And so, I mean, it's a sort of a double-edged proposition, but I think there's been across the board a sense that the ways that philanthropy has operated over the last decade or so, and the larger political economy that it's both been a part of, that has fed it and that it's fed, are deeply flawed and in need of careful, considered reform. I think there's been a very few moments in American history over the last, say, century or so when the actual possibility of reform to the philanthropic system and the ideas that undergird it were actually live. And I think we're in one of those moments now.
Thanks, Ben. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I see a lot of hope in is I think there has been some like de-siloing of religion from the other, sort of pillars of philanthropic work. And I mean, I think, Jason's work is testament to that in the sense that it used to be that Muslim communities were seen only through either a racial lens or a religious lens, depending on what philanthropy you were working with. This is something I experienced quite a bit at Shoulder to Shoulder, being told so many times, we don't fund faith or we don't fund interfaith. I'm like, okay, well, let's see it, through this angle of racial justice sort of work. But it used to be that you kind of had to do that dance. And I think that still happens, but I think it's happening less and less. And I think in general, there has been a move based on a lot of these types of conversations happening from seeing faith as sort of a siloed piece of the work to seeing it, interconnected with all of the work that a philanthropy is trying to do to make change in the world, that it's a cross-cutting sort of factor that needs to be paid attention to. And I think I've seen moves towards that. So that gives me quite a bit of hope.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to you all, because I think you're demonstrating the nuance and the complexities of pulling these topics of religion and philanthropy together in the ways, maybe even if we are in, or as we are in this moment of crisis, around questions of religion, civil society, and philanthropy, that there is hope, I think, for moments of change and engagement. And I'm grateful for all of you who've been a part of this conversation with us.